My name is Linda Vita, and I'm the director of the Water Resources Center Archives here on the Berkeley campus. And we are the main logistical sponsor of this event. And I work with a faculty committee that's from different departments across campus, and the committee selects the speakers each semester. And we have a variety of brochures in the back. We also have an email list. If you are currently not getting a reminder 1 week prior to the lecture, please sign the email list and we will start sending you those reminders. And one other thing is that next month the lecture will be on May 6th, and we're having Thomas Dunn, and he's going to talk about rivers. So with that, I'd like to introduce Professor David Sedlak, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Thanks, Linda. So that's on, right? To paraphrase Coleridge, wouldn't it be great to drink that seawater over there? That is, for many years, people have had a dream of being able to exploit the ocean as a source of water, and for many years, this dream seemed like it was kind of far-fetched and crazy, the kind of thing that you could do if you lived in the desert and had a lot of oil, or if you lived in Santa Barbara and were desperate. And it wasn't until a few years ago that the prospect of widespread desalination in California became more feasible, and that is due to a variety of different reasons, including improvements in membrane technology that brought down the cost of seawater desalination, a sense of frustration about the possibility of developing alternative sources of water, and I guess a legal and political quagmire that made it difficult to imagine acquiring more water rights in communities that needed it. And so now we stand in this year or the last couple of years with 20 or 30 new desalination projects proposed or in the planning stage up and down the coast of California. And if all of these projects were to be built, it would account for a small but significant percentage of California's urban water supply. You hear a lot of people talking about it. There's a number of public meetings in communities where desalination has been proposed, and you'll hear opinions on it ranging from good, bad, to terrible. And really, it depends on your perspective. And so we thought it would be a good idea to have someone who's taken a close look at desalination from environmental perspectives, from regulatory perspectives, and from economic perspectives to give us some education on the prospects for desalination in California. And that's why Heather Cooley's here tonight. So Heather's going to talk about basically a report that came out from Pacific Institute last year on desalination called Desalination with a Grain of Salt, a California Perspective. You can find the whole report on the Pacific Institute's website if you want more information beyond the talk tonight. Heather comes to us from Berkeley, where she got an undergraduate degree, and then she got a master's degree at Berkeley in the group, and she's been at the Pacific Institute, and that's in Oakland, right, ever since. And so Heather is a senior associate there, and she has an area of expertise in water and water supply. Desalination is just one of the areas. She's also done research in water efficiency and other alternative water sources. And we look forward very much to her talk. Thank you, Heather.
Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction, David. And I'd like to thank Linda and everyone at the Water Resource Center Archives for inviting me here today. It's really a great resource, and you're very lucky to have that here on campus. Again, my name is Heather Cooley. I'm with the Pacific Institute. The Pacific Institute is a research institute based in downtown Oakland. We do work on a variety of issues ranging from globalization to kind of local issues, local air quality issues associated with the port. And we're probably best known for our work on water and water supply, both at the international level and also kind of at the California western level. Incidentally, we celebrated our 20th anniversary just last October. I encourage you to look at our website and kind of look at the range of issues that we work on. In June of 2006, the Pacific Institute finished an analysis about seawater desalination within kind of the context of California. Funding for the report was provided by the Resource Legacy Foundation, as well as the Packard Foundation, with also some minor funds provided by the Hewlett Foundation and the Flora Family Foundation. Because of this report, the Pacific Institute in general, and I in particular, have been labeled as one of the, let me read the quote here, one of the leading critics of expanding desalination. Unfortunately, I disagree with this characterization. I think it's very much a mischaracterization of the report and the work that we've done. I think that I in this report should actually be looked at kind of as a friend of the industry in terms of encouraging and leading to appropriately designed and sited desalination plants. And I would argue that actually the largest foe to desalination are those who push for it and build plants that are ultimately useless and not used. And we definitely have some clear examples of that, not only in California, also internationally, and also in the US. So with that, we undertook this report in order so that both the public and decision makers could really look at the advantages and disadvantages of desalination and really assess the arguments being put forward by both proponents and opponents of desalination. Ultimately, the decision to pursue seawater desalination will be a local one. But I believe that this decision should be done in an open and transparent way based on the best available information in a very clear understanding of the potential risks and the benefits. So with that, tonight, I want to talk a bit about the history of desalination, and then I will discuss a brief overview of the desalination process. Then I would like to discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of seawater desalination, which I have organized as kind of the economic, environmental, and social considerations. And then I want to conclude with the discussion of climate change and seawater desalination and kind of the three important ways that these issues intersect. So in terms of the history, the idea of separating salt from water is one that dates back to ancient times when it was really salt that was the precious commodity. Salt was used both as a currency and also really to preserve our foods, and it's what enabled many of our exploration of lands, particularly by ship. Ironically, it was really the shipping and the maritime culture that really required desalination for freshwater as well. And so many of the early efforts centered around providing water to those on ships. Curacao in the Netherlands Antilles was really one of the first countries to make a really major commitment to desalination. And desalination plants have been operating there since about 1928. And even the local beer is made with desalinated seawater. A major plant was built in Saudi Arabia in what is now Saudi Arabia back in 1938. And so desalination and seawater desalination in particular has a very long history. It's not a brand new technology. It's one we've been doing for quite a while. Today, desalination, as of January 2005, is practiced in about 110 different countries. There are an estimated 2,700 seawater desalination plants worldwide, with an installed capacity of about 6 million acre-feet per year. So just to put that number into perspective, California's urban water use is currently about 9 million acre-feet. So about 2/3 of California's use is generated via desalination every year. I would like to, while I've just given you those numbers, I would also like to kind of give a cautionary note. The database from which I pulled those numbers includes plants that were contracted but never built but never operated, or operated and are no longer. So that's kind of a best case scenario. My guess is that there's significantly fewer plants that are actually in operation today. As shown in this figure here, the vast majority of plants are located in the Middle East. About 25% of the installed capacity is in Saudi Arabia, and another 25% in the United Arab Emirates. What this figure doesn't show is that there are some small island nations around the world that are heavily dependent on seawater desalination. And while the installed capacity may be small there, it is a very important source. So in general, seawater desalination is practiced in oil-rich and/or water-scarce regions. But as David mentioned in the introduction, that may be changing. Seawater desalination has typically been only a minor component of California's water supply portfolio. The California Coastal Commission, in a recent report released a few years ago, lists about a dozen mostly small desalination facilities along California's coast. The total capacity of these plants is about 7,000 acre-feet per year. And for people not familiar with acre-feet, they estimate about an acre-foot provides 2 households with water for a year. So again, the total capacity in California is about 7,000 acre-feet. Most of these are small facilities, generally that provide high-quality water for industrial purposes or for power plant cooling. However, there are a few that are used for municipal uses, and those are shown here on this figure. In most cases, however, they're inactive or only used intermittently. There's really only one actively used desalination purpose, and that's at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And they use seawater desalination to produce water for their toilets, essentially. So, and it's a very small use. That's about the only one in active use. But I want to draw your attention to the plant in Santa Barbara. I'm listed here as having a capacity of about 2.8 million gallons per day. This is the largest plant in California. It is inactive as shown here. As many of you know in this room, California experienced a very major drought that extended from 1987 to 1992. This drought hit Santa Barbara particularly hard because they're reliant, at that time, they were very reliant on local precipitation and local groundwater sources. And they had implemented quite a bit of conservation, and they were actually successfully able to reduce their demand by 40%. But given the length and the intensity of the drought, by 1991, many of their reservoirs were drying up. At that time, the residents overwhelmingly supported building, they voted and supported building a seawater desalination plant at a cost of about $34 million. On the same ballot, they also wanted to connect to the State Water Project. It was another very kind of capital-intensive project, but one in which the cost of connecting to the State Water Project would decline over time as they had paid the bonds. At that time, the cost of both the desal plant and the State Water Project were about $1,500 an acre foot. But again, as I mentioned, the cost for the State Water Project would decline over time. So Santa Barbara partnered with 2 or 3 local water agencies to build the plant. It was much more expensive than many of the local sources that they were currently using, but again, along the same level as the State Water Project. So they received the appropriate permits, particularly from the Coastal Commission. That tends to be kind of the hardest permit to get. And the plant was completed in March of 1992. The plant successfully produced desalinated water, but shortly thereafter the drought ended, and water demand never fully rebounded after the drought, in part because many of the water conservation and efficiency improvements that they had installed continued to provide water savings even after the drought. So some of the low-flow toilets, some of the other fixtures actually reduced demand in the long term. In addition, the cost of producing the desalinated water was so high that they really couldn't justify producing it during non-drought years. After 5 years, there was an initial contract phase. After 5 years, the partnering agencies all pulled out, and it became kind of the sole property of Santa Barbara. Eventually, again, the plant was put into long-term standby. Eventually, Santa Barbara decided to sell off half of the plant to a company in Saudi Arabia and is now operating on the other side of the globe. And the plant has been decommissioned, in part because even maintaining a plant in standby entails some capital outlay. And now the cost to start up the plant and the timing to actually start up the plant are largely unknown. And in fact, many of the technologies that were installed in this plant, it was built 15 years ago, are no longer kind of state-of-the-art, as you might imagine. So that's kind of California's history of desalination. It hasn't yet been successfully done on the large scale, although that may be changing. This map shows the proposed plants in California as of the spring of 2006, which is when we had completed this report. As you can see, plants are generally extending from here, the Bay Area, south. The points shown in blue generally tend to be some of the smaller plants producing less than 5 million gallons per day. The dots shown in black, generally kind of centered around the Southern California, tend to be some of the larger plants, producing about 20 million gallons per day to 50 million gallons per day. Since this report was completed, I went back and called many of the people who were putting forth proposals. 2 of the largest plants have been taken offline. Those were 2 that were at that time, were being pursued by the San Diego County Water Authority. It's really no surprise that the Carlsbad one was taken offline. Those were kind of dueling proposals, one being put forth by Poseidon, one being put forth by San Diego County Water Authority, so it's no surprise that eventually one of them was going to fall off. But the 2 that were canceled were among some of the larger ones. Here in the Bay Area, there's talk of putting in or installing 4 plants. One shown there in Crockett would be at the C&H sugar factory. That is one that's being built by East Bay Mud. They've actually already received some grant funding for that. And are moving forward on this project. It's a relatively small plant, and the water would be used on site and would offset potable water that East Bay Mud currently delivers to the C&H sugar factory. Also, Montara, out there on the coast, is also thinking of building a plant. This also would be very small. They're still in the very initial phases doing feasibility studies. It's not quite clear that that's going to happen anytime soon. San Rafael, however, recently completed their environmental impact report. They just closed public comment on March 28th, so two weeks or so, and are deciding whether or not to move forward on that. And the largest plant proposed for the Bay Area is I have it shown here in Pittsburgh, although the location has not yet been determined, but that would be a regional plant with Santa Clara Valley Water District, East Bay Mud, San Francisco Public Utility Commission, and the Contra Costa Water District. They're currently preparing feasibility and environmental studies. The size of it, they're not quite clear yet, anywhere from 20 to 80 million gallons per day. So this would be a fairly large plant. They're thinking of 3 locations, one being Pittsburgh, which is where I showed it here, in part because the other areas were a little clogged up, but also they're considering Oakland and Oceanside. And so, the economics of that plant will change depending on where their source is. The Pittsburgh plant generally having much less saline water, whereas the Oceanside having the more saline water. And so, at some point they're gonna decide the location, although when is not quite clear. And down in Southern California, as I mentioned, these tend to be some of the larger plants. Those are also, some of those are further along in the process. 2 of note would be the plant shown here in Huntington Beach and Carlsbad. The Carlsbad plant would be built by Poseidon Resources. They're a private company, and they would then sell the water to water utilities in the general vicinity of that plant. They have received conditional approval from the California Coastal Commission, and as I mentioned previously, that's kind of the largest hurdle to overcome. My sense is that in July of this year, if I remember correctly, the Coastal Commission will make kind of a final approval of this plan if they choose to do so. So, and as David mentioned, building these plants would be a massive increase in the desalination capacity. The current capacity, installed capacity, is about 6 million gallons per day, and so this would represent, if all of these plants were built, it would represent about a 70-fold increase in the capacity. So again, it's a very large increase, driven largely by concerns about water scarcity, dropping cost of desalination, and I would argue some desal proponents that have been kind of lobbying for and pushing these efforts further along. So in this next slide, I want to talk a bit about the process of desalinating water. Desalination process occurs naturally all around us every day. The Earth's hydrologic cycle naturally desalinates water using solar energy. So solar energy really drives evaporation from the ocean. That water then turns into water vapor and rains down as fresh water. And in fact, many of the earliest desalination plants were based on this process. It was a thermal desalination, in which they would heat seawater, collect the water vapor, recondense it, and produce fresh water. Today, reverse osmosis is really the choice being pursued by most of the larger plants. During natural osmosis, before I talk about reverse osmosis, talk a little bit about natural osmosis. If you have two concentrations, salt concentrations, two liquids with differing salt concentrations separated by a membrane, generally water will flow from the less concentrated solution through the membrane to the more concentrated solution until both sides, until the concentration of the solution on both sides is equal. Reverse osmosis really uses pressure to force the saline water through the membrane, leaving salts on one side and pushing through the fresh water on the other side. Here I show, get my little clicker here. Here is what the reverse osmosis membranes tend to look at. They're generally encased in these kind of plastic sheaths here and are put in a row. The water is kind of forced through, and then the fresh water is collected on one side, and the saline is diverted towards another. So an RO system is made up of these general components. Water is taken in from the ocean, and where it goes to a pretreatment system. Pretreatment is necessary to really remove contaminants and to prevent fouling or microbial growth on the membranes. Generally, pretreatment consists of adding some chemicals to encourage precipitation of any of these contaminants or solutes, and then that solution is then filtered. After it's filtered, it then makes its way to the reverse osmosis membranes, where again it's a high pressure pump pushes the water through. The saline wastewater is then diverted and generally disposed of into the ocean, and the fresh water then moves on through to post-treatment. Generally, if we're thinking about a 50 million gallon per day plant, that refers to the amount of water that's produced. In order to produce that, the plant takes in about 100 million gallons per day. So about 50% of the water makes its way through to the post-treatment. The other 50% is disposed of in the ocean. And the water disposed of in the ocean is generally twice as saline because all of the salt from the fresh water has been put into to that water. It also contains some of the chemicals used in the pretreatment system, which I'll get back to that issue in a little bit. So after going through the reverse osmosis process, the water must then undergo post-treatment. Many of the nutrients and membranes have been stripped of that water. It's often referred to as hungry water. You cannot put that water directly into your distribution system. If you do, it has a tendency to corrode your pipes by leaching minerals out of your pipes. Often lime, chloride, fluoride, and kind of other minerals are added back to that water before it's then distributed into your distribution system. So for the remainder of my talk, I want to focus more on the advantages and disadvantages of desalination. As I mentioned, I've kind of organized them into three different areas. The first, and the question I get asked most often, is how much does it cost? Well, the cost is often reported in ways that are not very comparable. Some report the cost to produce water, while others will report the cost to actually deliver water to the customers. Some will report the predicted cost, whereas others will report the actual cost, and oftentimes those can be very different. There are also subsidies, both visible and hidden, that affect the cost. For example, the Metropolitan Water District down in Southern California is providing a subsidy in the amount of $250 per acre foot of water produced, yet oftentimes in the paper and in other sources, the cost is reported both with and without the subsidy, and it's often not clear which is reporting where. So I would caution kind of simply looking at the cost. In addition, to make matters even more complicated, the costs are very site-specific, and simple cost comparisons can be very misleading. The size of the plant affects the cost. Generally, your larger plants can produce water at a lower cost. The temperature and the salinity also affect the cost. Colder, more saline water is more difficult to desalinate, and therefore the costs of that water tend to be higher. So for example, in the Middle East, much of that water, and along the Mediterranean, much of that water is saltier than water here on the Pacific Ocean. And so doing a simple comparison between the cost in California and the cost in the Middle East is not a very fair comparison. In addition, energy cost makes a large difference on the cost of desalinated water. And as we know, energy costs are highly variable around the world and also over time. In addition, many of the plants, energy cost is subsidized, particularly during the first couple of years in some countries. That may or may not be completely visible at first, it may not be reported in that matter. So it's always important to really to look into what the cost is and try to figure out kind of what's going on. In general, we've found that the costs have fallen in recent years due to improvements in membrane performance, a trend towards the construction of larger plants, and also just improved project management and experience. There's a learning curve with these plants, and as we do more and more, the cost tends to come down. The costs currently range from about $1,100 to $2,000 per acre foot. Some of the smaller plants that are being proposed, for example, the San Rafael plant, the Marin or San Rafael plant, tends to be even higher than this because it would be a smaller plant. Optimists predict that continued cost reductions with a long-term goal of reducing the cost by 50% by the year 2020. I would caution against kind of excessive optimism on that, in part because the past is not necessarily a good predictor of the future, and some of the easier achievements in membrane performance that were accomplished over the past 10 to 15 years may not continue. In addition, many of the newer estimates that are coming in about the cost are actually slightly higher than they were a few years ago. And that's due to rising capital costs and rising energy costs. As you know, oil costs are creeping over $100 a barrel, and as prices go up, the cost of desalination goes up. So that brings me to the next topic, and that is energy. Energy is a significant, if not the major component of the cost of desalination. There has been significant research focused on reducing energy use, particularly through energy recovery devices, but it's still the largest single variable cost. And in the past couple of years, there's been kind of increasing attention on the connections between water and energy, particularly in California, where we move and transport water significant different distances. The California Energy, a few years ago, 2005, came out with a report on the connections between water and energy in California. And they found that about 20% of California's electricity use and a third of our natural gas use, that's non-electricity, but natural gas use, is water related. Now, much of that is end use, so that's the energy we use to heat water for showers, clothes washers, those kinds of things. But water sources in California have different energy uses. Water is heavy, weighing about 8 pounds per gallon, and as we're moving at large distances, that has some serious energy implications. And when we're looking into the future, thinking about implementing Assembly Bill 32, which was the executive order put forth by Schwarzenegger to reduce and cap our greenhouse gas emissions, we really need to start paying attention to this link between energy and water. Here I show the energy intensity of water sources in San Diego County. Now, San Diego County relies on both local groundwater, but they also import a significant amount of their water through the Colorado River Aqueduct here and the State Water Project. So this graph shows the energy intensity of the various water sources in San Diego County on equivalent kilowatt hours per million gallons. As you can see here, there's a significant amount of variation. You'll notice here I've thrown in kind of ocean towed water bags. That's not currently used in San Diego, but just put it up there to kind of give you an idea of what that might look like on an energy basis. It's not something I think is necessarily politically feasible, but it does kind of add it's an interesting another layer of this. As you can see here, seawater desalination. Oh, let me briefly mention, the reason we chose San Diego County for this is because that is the furthest distance that water is actually transported in California. The State Water Project takes water out of the Delta sends it down through the San Joaquin Valley, up and over the Tehachapi's, which is the single largest lift in the world, and therefore, as you might imagine, very energy intensive. Some of that energy is recaptured as the water kind of tumbles down the other side of the Tehachapi's, but then that water, again, travels all the way down to San Diego. Same with the Colorado River to Aqueduct. That's generally the furthest point. And so we use this because the difference between seawater desalination and some of these others would be at a minimum. In other parts of the coast, particularly those that are relying on local water sources, the difference between their water supply and desalination would be much greater. As you can see in this figure, desalination is the most energy intensive source available. It's roughly about 4,200 kilowatt hours per acre foot. And because of this energy intensity, relying on it really increases the water supplier's exposure to energy price increases over time and also to annual variation in energy price. And I think this next slide will really drive that point home and will help me elaborate on that a little bit. So this figure shows the relative cost of potable water. This is in Southern California, and I show 3 different water sources. Desalinated water is up there on the top, a recycled water, and then a gravity surface water. And for all of these, I say relative cost because I've normalized the cost based on their 1971 values. That is not to say that the costs were equal in that year, but it does really enable us to look at changes over time on a relative basis. Here we've looked at how the price of these different water sources would vary using actual energy use estimates between 1971 and 2005. And as shown, for all of the water sources, there tends to be an upward trend in price. Energy prices have gone up during that time, and as a result, the cost of these water supplies has gone up. Now again, this is holding all other things equal. We didn't look at changes or reductions in membrane costs or anything like that. This is specifically looks at how energy price trends would affect the cost of these water sources. So again, all of these show an increase because energy prices have gone up. But the increase for desalinated seawater is much greater than the increase seen in the other water sources because it is such an energy-intensive source. So between 1971 and the 2005, desalinated seawater went up by a factor of 2.5, whereas recycled seawater went up by a factor only of 2. What this graph also shows is that there's annual variation and that these are amplified for your more energy-intensive source. So I would draw your attention here particularly to the energy crisis of 2000. We saw energy prices spike considerably. And the spike here is much greater for the desalinated seawater than it is for the lower energy gravity surface water. Thus, potable water produced by seawater desalination rises in cost more rapidly than the other sources and has greater year-to-year variability, because less of the cost is due to actual fixed capital expenses and more of it's due to energy use. This should also kind of set off some bells because of drought. In California, energy prices tend to go up during a drought because we do use hydroelectricity, and during a drought, there's less of that available, and so energy prices go up. There's also a greater demand for energy as it tends to be hot, and many people are using their air conditioners and other kind of appliances at a much higher level. And so during a drought, which many agencies are proposing to use desalination during, what we would see is that the cost of the desalinated seawater would be higher during that period. That can generate some additional revenue instability for water suppliers. Many water suppliers are already dealing with that because they're trying to reduce demand in order to make sure they have enough money, but it can create some instability in terms of maintaining and operating their system. By switching to desalinated seawater, that can create some additional instability and create additional issues for them. And so I would argue that in terms of if a water agency is considering pursuing desalination, that they really look at these issues and make their choices based on, in part, on this issue of rising energy costs. So in this next slide, I want to discuss another issue that affects the cost, but is often not framed in that manner, and that's reliability and water supply diversity. So seawater desalination provides a very high-quality source of water that is largely independent of weather conditions. So that can obviously be important during a drought or as an adaptation to climate change. You simply turn the plant on or off when you need it or don't need it. Other water sources, let's say a reservoir or a groundwater system, are much more sensitive to your weather patterns. Desalination is not. Desalination can also increase your supply diversity, and as you know from kind of doing your finances, that can be a very good thing. You don't want to be too reliant on one source, because if there are changes in that, it doesn't give you a lot of options. It also provides a source that is under direct local control, which can be a very big issue for, say, Southern California, which is importing a lot of their water. For them, it would be a great benefit to have something under their control that they can use when and if they need it. But how do we compare water sources that have very different reliability levels? That adds kind of an extra dimension to this problem. If you're simply taking the cost at face value, that can lead to very apples to oranges comparisons. We put forth in the report a way of assessing water sources of different reliability levels based on kind of a financial portfolio theory. And in the next two slides, I'm going to try to give you kind of a qualitative description of what that might look like for those who have a tendency to enjoy math. Not one of them myself. But I would point you to our online appendices, which goes into great detail about some of the theory behind it. So in this next slide, I look at two kind of water sources, a new surface water and a desalinated recycled water. So let's say that a community is growing, and they know that they need to acquire about 2,000 acre-feet of water during a drought year. They're looking again at two sources, a surface water source and a desalination or recycled water, kind of any source that you can just turn on or turn off when you need it. Now, for this purposes, let's say that the cost of these two options is equal, but they have very different reliability levels. So on the one case, let's look at the surface water system. We know that they need to ensure that there's 2,000 acre-feet in a dry year, and in order to ensure that, they must size their facility much larger to ensure that during that dry year, when their supply is variable, that they have enough. Because they're sizing their facility larger, it means that each unit of water during the drought will actually cost more than the amount shown here. For here, let's assume it's $600 per acre foot. Just throwing that number out there, not a very accurate number. But if we look at it on a constant reliability level, that cost may actually be higher. Because desalination is really independent of weather conditions, the cost on a constant reliability benefit is the same. It's still $600 per acre foot. So for the surface water, if we adjust the cost based on this constant reliability, it may actually be higher than the desalination. So while at first glance, a water supply planner may think options are very similar in cost, they may be, in fact, quite different. The same kind of calculation can also be performed with water of very different quality. We also do some examples in the report to give you a little more idea. And it also kind of points to the need for adjusting the water cost accordingly, and failing to do so may make a water planner think that two things are the same when in fact they're very different. I next want to talk a bit about the environmental issues associated with desalination. Seawater desalination can provide some environmental benefits, specifically on source displacement. So it may allow us to actually reduce the quantity of water we're taking from our overtaxed rivers and streams, leaving that water in the system and then transferring and actually taking water from the ocean. It's important to note, however, that there's really no formal mechanism to ensure that that is actually what's going to happen. Project proponents can make promises about, we're going to return X number of acre feet back to the environment. This has an environmental benefit. But in many ways, there's no real legal mechanism to ensure that that's going to happen. There is one exception of the plants that are being proposed in California, And that's a plant at Moss Landing in the Monterey Bay region. To give you a little bit of history, back in 1995, the State Water Resource Control Board ruled that the water company there, California American Water Company, was taking water above its water rights from the Carmel River, and they ordered them to stop doing so. That was it's referred to as Order 9510. That order came through in 1995. And as part of that order, they had said that any new supply that you produce must offset your withdrawals from the Carmel River on a one-to-one basis. So in that case, in that particular case, any desalination or any other source that they produce will reduce pumping from the Carmel River and provide some environmental benefit. I think it's important to note, it's been 13 years. There's been very little movement on that, and actually the State Water Resource Control Board a week and a half ago issued a cease and desist order to California American Water Company because of the continued pumping and overpumping of the Carmel River. So that's kind of an interesting issue to follow in the next year or so as they consider and are moving forward in building a desal plant. In addition to the environmental advantages, however, desalination also poses some environmental risks. So I'm going to take you back to the slide I originally showed. As I mentioned, water is taken into the desal plant often directly from the ocean, and brine is discharged often directly into the ocean. And that brine, it contains chemicals used throughout the desalination process, as well as a significant amount of salt. So the two environmental impacts are so associated with those processes. Here, generally they have pumps that are pulling in large amounts of water. Medium to large fish can actually be trapped and killed on the intakes. And some of the smaller eggs, larvae, and small fish may actually be sucked into the plant. It's a process referred to as entrainment, and killed during the pretreatment process. And much of that, those organisms then are discharged along with this brine. So the brine then contains not only high salt concentrations, chemicals, and also some of the marine organisms that are entrained into the plant. Because it's generally denser than the receiving waters, it tends to sink and move along the bottom of the receiving water body, where it tends to be a little bit less well mixed, and so it can pose a risk to some of the benthic organisms, particularly the sessile ones that can't really get out of the way. They also find that some habitats are much more sensitive. Reefs and rocky shore areas tend to be more sensitive than some of the other areas. And if you're in kind of an enclosed bay, the salt and the chemical concentration can accumulate much more so than in a kind of a high energy wave coastline. One way to mitigate some of these impacts is through beach wells. And here I show a beach well in Spain. With beach wells, the water is actually pumped from a well that's drilled beneath the beach, and the sand acts as a natural filter, and therefore it eliminates some of the impingement, or all of the impingement and entrainment impacts. And it also results in a water that is much more consistent and can greatly reduce some of your pretreatment costs. So it actually has kind of a win-win associated with it. This technology is being considered for some of the smaller plants, but because the wells have a limited amount of water that they can actually take in through the sand, it's generally limited to about 1.5 million gallons per day. So if we're thinking about some of these larger 50 million gallon per day, we'd be talking about 20, 30, 40 wells along your beach, which may themselves have some environmental impacts associated with actually drilling and disturbing the sand. But this technology is being looked at for some of the smaller plants. And my guess is it'll be kind of where agencies turn to in order to mitigate their impacts. So I want to briefly mention some of the social impacts or social considerations. As I mentioned, desalination is much more expensive than many of the local water sources, and so water rates will rise. This obviously has a disproportionate impact on low-income communities and also the elderly who may be on a fixed income. In addition to disproportionate impacts via water rates, many low-income communities generally tend to live in around some of the industrial areas, and therefore may have to suffer some of the impacts associated with increasing energy use or even the brine discharge. Many communities are relying on fishing to provide their primary protein source, and may, discharging the brine into the waterways may affect them. In addition, many of these plants are being proposed in areas that are constrained by water. Some of these areas actually have outright growth moratoriums based on the amount of water available. And so by providing another source of water, you actually are going to likely increase coastal development. And while these generally can be either a good or a bad thing, it is an issue that local communities really need to be aware for and plan for. If it's not a desirable outcome, then kind of setting very strict boundaries on where they will deliver water and where they won't can kind of help to alleviate that problem. But it is something that communities really need to be thinking about. And finally, I want to talk a bit about climate change and the interactions with seawater desalination. Seawater desalination and climate change really interact in three important ways. The first is that desalination plants are coastal infrastructure, and therefore they're going to be vulnerable to not only rising sea levels, but increases in storm intensity and frequency. So it is critical, really, that proposed plants take this into consideration when designing both their outfall location, their intakes, and also simply the location of the plant. In the projects that I've looked at in the environmental impact report, it's not quite clear that they're yet doing that. But given that these systems are going to exist for at a minimum 30 years, we will see impacts associated with climate change much more than we currently are today by then. In addition, however, seawater desalination can be considered an adaptation to climate change. As I mentioned, it's largely independent of weather conditions. We can turn it off or turn it on when we need it. And so, as we look at a climate and precipitation levels that are much more variable, this may enable us to cope with these impacts. But desalination is also very energy intensive and can contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. On this last point, there's actually a fair amount of work that's going on to address this issue. Poseidon Resources, as I mentioned recently, is proposing to build a large desalination plant in Carlsbad. In last November, they were given conditional approval for a coastal development permit from the Coastal Commission, but one of those conditions was related to their carbon emissions. The Coastal Commission wanted to see a plan that would look at how Poseidon was going to offset their carbon emissions associated with their high energy use. And now, while Poseidon is still working out the details, they actually released an article about it yesterday, some of the preliminary plans. They're looking at increasing the efficiency of pumps, so installing pumps that they may not have installed otherwise because it may not have been cost effective. They're also considering installing solar on the facility and reforesting some of the fire-affected areas in San Diego County. Their final proposal is due in July. And it will likely affect many of the future plants in California, particularly given the greenhouse gas emission targets that we're working to implement. A desalination in Perth is actually taking a slightly different approach. This plant was completed in November 2006. It's a fairly large plant, producing about 37 million gallons per day. Their energy requirements are relatively high at about 6,000 kilowatt hours per acre foot. If you remember some of the earlier slides I showed, put it at about 4,000 kilowatt hours per acre foot. But they will entirely power it by a nearby wind farm. And this is actually it is the first and largest of the desal plants that would be powered by alternative energy sources. In London, officials are actually considering building a plant powered by biodiesel. So there is a fair amount of work going on in this. In most cases, it's not yet cost effective to be entirely solar or entirely wind, but as we look at kind of curbing our greenhouse gas emissions, those may become increasingly favorable over time. So in conclusion, I believe and feel that desalination will likely play an important role in California's water supply portfolio. It's not really a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And when we do choose to do it, it's a matter of how we do it. I believe that it's not a technical issue, that really the issues we need to come are associated with the cost, the energy use, and the environmental impacts. And I think it's also important that we really consider some of the alternatives that may provide the same benefits as desalination at lower cost, both economic, environmental, and social. Some of these alternatives might include water conservation and efficiency, wastewater recycling, better use of our groundwater, conjunctive use, better management of our stormwater. So we have many options available, and it's important if we're going to move forward on desalination because of its high cost, energy requirements, environmental impacts, that we implement some of these kind of lower cost alternatives first. So our report, I brought a few copies of the report with me. I'd be happy if people took these off my hands. I would like not to carry them. But you can also go to our website and download a free copy of the report or order hard copies online. So with that, I'll be happy to entertain any questions. Yes?
Nuclear power.
Yes. There are people thinking about that, although I haven't seen many proposals for it. The question was if people were considering nuclear-powered desalination. Some people I've heard that described as their worst nightmare. About
new or existing.
New,
Well,
from what I
it's not going to happen until they
right.
change the law, so.
Well, in the U.S., I guess.
State.
Right. Right. But then, at the international level, there may be, obviously, in the back.
So given the energy intensity of the reverse osmosis process, has there been any sort of revisiting of more ancient techniques of basically letting the sun evaporate a bunch of water on a really large scale?
Yes. So the question was, given the energy intensity of reverse osmosis, is there kind of any movement towards using some of the older technologies, for example, using solar power? There have generally, reverse osmosis is actually even less energy intensive than some of the older thermal desalination. They're moving more towards reverse osmosis because of the reduction in costs associated with the membrane. Solar, I've heard about some smaller plants here and there, but generally not on the kind of large scale, 50, 80 million gallon per day that tends to be the trend that's been occurring. Yes?
The larger plants in California that are further along the process of being completed. Do you know, or can you comment on how they're planning to tackle some of the environmental problems, like the bracket or the water that they'll be discharging, or the water that they'll be taking for the biological effect?
Right. I have the ones that I've seen are proposing to mitigate it by purchasing and restoring wetlands in the surrounding area, although there's some debate about what the surrounding area means, and whether it's in the immediate vicinity or somewhere else along the California coast. The one I just referred to is actually what Poseidon has been proposing at Carlsbad, although again there's been debate both by the Coastal Commission and Poseidon about what form that should take. I should also mention, which I didn't go into in great detail, I talked about the environmental impacts. Part of the issue is we don't really know what the long-term environmental impacts are at this point. The studies that have been done thus far have really focused on either a single species or a single point in time. There hasn't been very much long-term monitoring. That is starting to change, specifically at the Tampa Bay plant, which was completed earlier this year. I know that there's some long-term monitoring that was required of that plant, but many of the other plants that has not yet been required. And so, particularly in that Poseidon, there is some debate about how much fish is actually killed via impingement and entrainment.
The Middle East plants, are they the biggest ones coming on now, or?
Some of the ones proposed in California would be among the biggest. I think the biggest is in Ashkelon, Israel, although there are some large ones in. I don't believe that one's already operating, and I don't believe it is. There are also some large plants proposed in Australia and Singapore. So, in general, the trend is towards much bigger plants. Yes.
The
desalination plants are at sea level, most of us live above that. And these gravity-fed systems are coming in 1 to 2,000 feet above sea level. In their cost estimates, did they ever include pumping up to some reasonable level, or is it just the output from the plant itself?
It depends. Some actually report the cost to deliver it to customers, and others simply report the cost to produce it. That's kind of part of the issue of being very careful of evaluating which costs they're actually stating. You know, in Southern California, much of that water is being imported, and so the energy differential is much smaller. For some of the ones, for example, the one proposed here in the Bay Area, much of our water is more likely to be gravity fed, and so the energy differential will be much larger. Yes?
Yeah, these plants are not 100% reliable, so I wonder what you have factored in as the downtime for these desal plants.
You are correct. They are not 100% reliable. Some, and in the example I showed, I did use that it was 100% reliable. That was more to simply illustrate a point rather than to say, rather than to claim that they're 100% reliable. Generally, the downtime associated with it is for cleaning the membranes. You know, it varies from plant to plant, and we did not do any kind of specific analysis on any particular project. Although I would argue that that type of analysis does need to occur if we're going to look at kind of the costs, the actual costs. Yes?
I guess I want to make a comment and then ask a question. The comment I want to make is that a lot of the large desalination plants in California are being proposed to be co-located with existing power plants. And so the Poseidon plant, for example, is co-located with a power plant. The downside of that is that you're giving extended life to once-through cooling, which is something the Coastal Commission may not feel keenly about. The positive side about that is the impacts of impingement and the brine plume are minimized and generally small. So that's kind of an interesting area in policy and law and permitting in California that's special and different from most other places where desalination is proposed. But the question I wanted to ask is related to, you alluded to turning desalination plants on and off. And when I talk to engineers who design desalination plants, they tell me that that's not really too feasible. So how much does it affect the cost estimates for desalination? And are there examples of communities that routinely turn on and off large desalination plants?
No, there are not examples. Generally, it increases the cost considerably. And in the report, we talk about that it's probably pretty unlikely that you would actually turn it off. I refer to it more as an option in that it is reliable and can be used when needed. But the cost at this time is so high that it's very unlikely that they would use it during that they would use it only during a drought period. And I'm very glad you brought up that issue about co-location. We talk and go into detail about it in the report. I didn't go into detail about it here. Although interestingly, with the Poseidon, that they are planning to co-locate it. Although at this time, the power plant has chosen to transfer over to dry cooling, and so the effect of diluting the brine with additional cooling water is no longer available. Although the benefit from Poseidon's perspective is that they're able to use a pipe that's already in place, and so that can reduce their cost as building many of these pipes can be very expensive and have some environmental impacts associated with them. Yes?
I have two questions. The first is there is a separate problem, the growing salinity of the soil and the groundwater in the Central Valley, which is quite different from our general need for water. But the solution that's being proposed for that is also desalination. Is there any way of linking the two very distinct problems into a common potential solution? And then my second question really has to do with the datedness of the technology. You indicated that the Santa Barbara technology is already dated after 15 years. Yet the major changes have been in the membrane development. Membrane improvements are going to go on for years and years. So, isn't that something that should be built into the projections into the future?
Okay, great. Those are great great questions. So your first question was about kind of brackish water desalination and this issue of salinization of inland water. Yes, definitely. And there are proposals, and there's also the possibility to desalinate brackish groundwater, and that in fact is occurring. Although the issue inland is how do you dispose of the brine? It's actually a much kind of more complicated and expensive option than simply discharging on the coast. Although that too has some environmental impacts, but in terms of cost, it is much cheaper. Desalinating brackish groundwater generally tends to be much less expensive than seawater because the salinity is lower. And I think in the future, as our concerns about water scarcity, population growth, economic growth, all of these things, and climate change, we're going to increasingly look towards doing just that. Your second question about the data technology and the Santa Barbara plant in particular, membranes are replaced periodically for cleaning. They generally have a lifetime, and that's one of the reasons the costs have come down quite a bit, is the lifetimes of these membranes have improved over time. There has been a significant amount of technological advancements in the past 15 years. My guess is that they're not going to continue at the same rate, but it is important to kind of design plants in which you can adjust the technology accordingly. Yes?
I would have liked to have seen a plot of the efficiency as a function of time over the years, and how close are we to theoretically maximum efficiency?
Okay, so let's see if I can pull the numbers out of my head. The theoretical maximum efficiency, I believe, is 4 kilowatt hours per 1,000 gallons. It's in the report, so if I have the numbers wrong, I would prefer you to that. And I believe we're in the range of 12 kilowatt hours, so about 3 times that. That's the thermodynamic efficiency potential. And there's a much greater discussion about that in the book. So there is potential, particularly with the use of energy recovery devices, and there's a significant amount of research going on that issue. Long Beach Water Department is actually, I think, doing a great job in terms of researching the potential for desalination. I often hold them up as an example of other agencies to follow. They're not using reverse osmosis. They're using kind of a dual ultrafiltration and nanofiltration in tandems. They're doing this dual filtration system, and they have actually reduced energy use considerably. They're also looking at using the beach wells and trying to develop in ways that are much less environmentally intensive and have a lower environmental impact. They've also been great about providing a lot of their data online, and I would encourage people who are interested in this issue to really look at some of the work that they're doing and other agencies to really model themselves after what they're doing. Yes?
You kind of stole my question about the co-location. That brings up a lot of things. One is that it's the stated policy of the California Coastal Commission to strongly influence those 21 power plants that are using once-through cooling to go to stop doing it. The other thing is, besides the 2 nuclear plants, those plants are all pretty old, they're pretty inefficient, and they just don't run a lot of the time. So it can be a very risky proposition. It's a nice idea, you have power there, but it's a very risky proposition to sink all that capital and then have the plant say, we don't want to do that. The second thing about that is the major reason for the once-through cooling is the implications that you stated about the impingement, if you ever say that. If you're co-locating an old power plant, you're using old intake structures, which now, you used to be able to get away with that, and then you can't as much anymore since the new rule in 2004. So I'm just wondering, how feasible is it if we don't have the co-location? You have to get an NPDES permit, I assume, because you have an intake and withdrawal. So if the co-location thing goes away on a large scale, do your costs and just your sort of environmental problems just snowball to make it almost impossible?
Right, I think those are great points. Yes, the state lands commission, the coastal commission, many agencies are strongly encouraging the power plants to move away from once-through cooling. It's estimated that there's about 17 billion gallons per day that are processed, and large numbers of marine organisms are killed in that process. There has been concern that by coupling up these seawater desalination plants, that's going to provide another economic justification to continue this antiquated technology. I would be surprised. Well, we'll see what the Coastal Commission does on this. My sense is they are trying to move and strongly discourage agencies from doing that, and also requiring them to analyze what their environmental impacts would be both with and without the power plant. And that would really enable them to get at this question of what are your environmental impacts independent of the power plant. So if we assume it's not even there, because in many cases the power plant will have to operate at levels at which it did not operate previously. So we cannot assume that the impingement and entrainment impacts are zero. They may actually be much greater. And given that it is this old technology, it could be worse than simply putting in some of the newer technologies. Yes.
Hi. So you were bringing up the issue about the rise in water rates due to desalination. Will this kind of rise? Do you see it as a local? Will it be within just one water district or a larger kind of regional water rate rise? And how common is the I assume somebody like the CNH sugar factory, although they use industrial, they wouldn't mind paying the rise in water rates, and due to using desalinated water. And so, how common is it that desalination projects are built for industrial use in California or in the world? So.
Okay. So your first question was about the water rates. I mean, it's a great question, and typically the water rates will go up for the agency that's proposing to build that plant. There may be some distribution of that for, say, a water wholesaler. So, say for Metropolitan, for example, is providing a subsidy to the water suppliers, and the cost of that subsidy would be borne out by all of its kind of retail agencies. But in general, if a small community is considering building a desal plant, that community will pay for it. Although there may be some state funds available through a grant funding or something along those lines. And in Santa Barbara, which I had mentioned, they spent $34 million on the desal plant that they didn't use. They are paying the capital costs for that, and they actually have one of the highest rates in the country. I believe some places their fixed service charge is in the order of $50, $60, $70 per month. That's just their fixed non-volumetric, which is incredibly high. And actually, if you want to think about water conservation and efficiency, having really high fixed service rates and very low volumetric rates does not do much for encouraging efficiency. And your second question? Industrial use, great. So as of now, much of the capacity in California, or many of the plants are just for that, for small industrial purposes. So on, let's say, oil and gas platforms, for example, or even energy plants that require, very high quality water for their operations. But again, most of the increase is proposed for municipal uses. Yes.
You've mentioned your pie chart of the cost breakdown had a figure of 44%
Yes.
of cost for electric energy.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if that, is it part of the process that has to be electric? Because you're talking about pressure. Is this something besides mechanical pressure that you can produce in some other way besides electricity? Or is that the only practical or really the only possible way to do this?
That's the only way that I have seen it. I'm not an expert in terms of, how do we power high pressure pumps, but I'm hearing some.
Just to speak to the kind of two things, I work at an energy company. We have, and I can't remember how big it is, a dual pass reverse osmosis system that takes delta water out, which is fun because the salinity changes hourly.
Right.
But it's pretty high. I can't remember now, but it's pretty high pressure. I used to know off the top of my head, but it kind of gets back to those plants aren't running, and there's this constant battle between you just keep running the water plant because it's cheaper to keep it online, because when you take it offline and put it to bed, it's extremely expensive and it's extremely difficult, and it takes a lot of time to get it back up and running. That's on a very small scale, so
You actually brought up an interesting point in terms of drawing out of the delta or other kind of source where the water quality is going to be highly variable. Exactly. It's kind of an interesting, many will think, well, and this was the case in Tampa Bay, actually, they wanted to use some of the fresher water because it's cheaper to desalinate. But it does create problems because there's less consistency, and so optimizing your pre-treatment and your filtration and your post-treatment can be very difficult. And so while at first blush it may appear to be kind of the easier, the smartest thing to do, it actually might be better to have a much more consistent, even if it's a higher salinity source water. You had a follow-up question.
Yeah, you mentioned also right off that you said that the decision to do this would be a local one. And that's sort of, I dream that it stays that way. But that's not the way these policy decisions usually end up shaking out. I mean, and I would predict we'll have 10 or 20 times as many of these plants if the costs are shared at the state level, where, let's make everybody else pay. It's too expensive for us locally, but somehow people believe that it's cheaper if you can get somebody else to pay.
Right.
And your chart on the plants or the table with the plants underway mentioned for this rocket plant that got Prop 50 funded.
It did.
That's not local money.
No, that's correct. That's correct. And so, in some cases, you might be able to argue, that there are some statewide environmental benefits. Let's say if we stop, pumping an aquifer or a river or stream, that they may have some. And so one could argue that perhaps in that case there should be some shared funding in that. It does bring up a lot of very interesting issues. I don't necessarily argue that, no. But it does bring up interesting issues in terms of all of these water supply options, right? Not just desalination. I think that would apply to, building reservoirs. This is kind of a question or an area of a concern that we need to discuss in greater detail. Agree. Yes? Yes. Okay.
I was
Go ahead.
about the brackish water in the old mines that's all full of water. Are they going to use it, and has there been a study? Because I've heard of that before, years ago.
Right, I haven't seen anything on that. And I guess it'll come down to how scarce is your source and how expensive is it to treat, and what other options are available. But I haven't seen anything specifically on that issue. Yes.
I was wondering about the Lingerie Bay Aquarium. How do they manage not to intake the fishes, and how do they handle their discharge?
My guess is that they do take in at least some amount of, there is some impingement and entrainment. It is a very, very small plant. It's 0.04 million gallons per day. That's its maximum capacity now. It may not operate. I have a hard time believing that they flush their toilets quite that much. But, they may also use it for some of their displays that they have. And I am not quite sure how they treat or release that wastewater, or the brine, excuse me. My guess is they could combine it with some of the seawater from their displays as well. Okay. Last question, go ahead.
I don't know if I missed this, but out of all the water coming into the plant, how much is actually transferred to usable water?
About 50%. So let's say 100 million gallons comes in, 50 million gallons would be discharged as brine, and 50 million would go to produce fresh water. In general, that's kind of an average. So, great.
Please join me in thanking Heather for a very interesting